And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, David Pizarro, political psychologist at Cornell University. Christina Tarnopolsky, professor of political science at McGill University. Chris Stockwell, former Speaker of the Ontario Legislature and Progressive Conservative Cabinet Minister. Richard Gwyn on the left side of the shot there, columnist with the Toronto Star. And Michael Valpy, senior writer with the Globe and Mail on the right-hand side. Good to have everybody around the table tonight for this discussion about the role emotion plays in our public policy and politics. And Michael, I want you to start us off, if you would, here. As we suggested in the opening, there is a kind of an uptick of interest lately in the relationship between emotion and politics. We haven't necessarily thought a lot about it in the past. We're thinking more about it now. How come?
Well, right now, the genesis of this, why we're all sitting around this table, is a public policy symposium organized by graduate students at the Universities of Toronto's Massey College and the School of Public Policy and Governance, which opens tonight and is on the subject of the role of emotion in public policy. And in fact, what's being demonstrated by a poll that was done for the students, made available to both the Globe and Mail and to TVO.
And we will show numbers throughout the course of the night.
Is that Canadians, and I'm sure Americans as well, think that they vote very rationally and that they eschew the idea of emotions in their political choices. And in fact, as I'm sure we're going to hear tonight, that's not the case.
Ain't necessarily so. David, give us the overview of the latest research. What are the psychological and neuroscience studies telling us about this kind of subject?
Well, you know, the role of emotion in judgment was so long ignored by psychologists, and I think part of it is the Enlightenment tradition led directly to us focusing on reasoning for so long. But in the past probably 10 years, although research on basic emotion for longer than that, has really started to show us how deep emotions infuse every level of judgment, whether it be the decision you made on what to wear for today's show or who to vote for. And so a lot of studies are showing, in particular, that neural structures that guide decision-making are the same ones that we know are active in very basic emotional reactions. So the same thing that might cause you to react with increased heart rate when you see a snake might also be driving your support for certain policies, for instance, national security judgments, decisions like that.
And there are studies that look at the various sort of aspects of the brain and can make those conclusions?
Absolutely. For example, the amygdala is part of our brain that is an old part of our brain, speaking in evolutionary terms. The amygdala is not only activated when you flash images of scary pictures like things that our ancestors would have had to be afraid of, like snakes and spiders, but research has shown that white college students have amygdala activation when they see black faces of African-American men. And the same sort of activation is shown when we make a variety of judgments, for instance, moral judgments, what we think of or perceive of as wrong. And most recently, political psychologist, notably Drew Western at Emory University, has been scanning people while they're making political judgments and showing that these same emotional structures are activated. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we've known maybe for a long time that emotions are active in the political arena. But just to show that these older structures are the ones that seem to be guiding much of our political thought is an insight that's only come in the past 10 years, perhaps.
Okay, you say spiders and snakes, and we're talking politics now, and everybody can make their own punchline on that one. How much, Christina, would you say emotion as opposed to reason affects the judgment and decision-making among leaders and politicians?
Well, based on my research, I'd have to say that emotion always affects. And in fact, I would say that emotion and reason can't be strictly separated the way in which the Enlightenment hoped that they could or thought that they could. And I think both the research in neuroscience, although I'd also have to put a plug in for my old guys in white togas, Plato and Aristotle always thought that emotions had rational components. So when we're feeling ashamed or angry, there's always an object of our anger, what it is that we're angry about, should we be that angry about that sort of thing. And so I think now people have to begin to think about politics, not as trying to keep emotions out and have these rational debates, but think about how we debate what are the particular objects of our anger, of our shame, how should we react to these emotions that are always going to be a part of human life, particularly political life.
Michael referenced a poll earlier in our discussion, and we're going to show our first numbers right now, and then Chris, I'll get you to comment on these first. A question about Canadian politics. Are Canadian federal politics too emotional or too rational? That was the question that was asked of Ecos in the Globe and Mail, and of course the symposium that's going on tonight. Are Canadian federal politics too emotional, too rational? 57% of those surveyed said too emotional, 15% said too rational. Chris, the numbers suggest emotion has a negative connotation for most people, and rational is a good thing. Based on your experience, what do you say?
Well, I guess it's how you determine what they were answering when they were answering the question. Is it too emotional? When you see question period, and you see the emotion that's evoked during question period and the give and take and the thrust, I think most Canadians would say that's too emotional, it's personal, it's too passionate. As far as the decision-making process, I don't think Canadians really have any idea whether it's emotional or if it's rational. They're not in the back rooms, they're not in the focus groups, they're not out there seeing those kinds of decisions and how they're made. Is it more emotional? I don't think it's emotional at all. I think practically every decision taken at the provincial and federal levels by elected parties is very, very structured, very thought out, and approached very carefully.
Cold, calculating, more rational?
Yeah, I mean, like, you talk wedge issues and things like that. Well, wedge issues are designed over a long period of time to be placed so you are positioned better as a party to win an election. Is there anything more calculating than that?
So, Richard, it plays emotional, but in fact, it's based in rationality. That's, I think, what Chris is saying. You've watched this stuff for 40-plus years. What do you say?
Well, I agree with Christine. I mean, the two are always intermixed. There are very few decisions that are purely rational, though we like to think it. And we'll all like to think, well, by the way, we're talking rationally when we're having this debate. And others wants to think this debate is an emotional debate. We always fake it a bit. But what has happened, I would argue, is a definite move toward the importance of emotion in politics and in life, and a diminution of the intellectual. I mean, one thing I would argue, for this is not because my background is a journalist, a print journalist, but the written word, the text, is declining in importance in our society. And what is rising is either the spoken word or the image. And those are much more emotional. And this is a product of the internet and so on. You can see it in the States, where emotional issues are absolutely dominant now. Now, they've always been there more, I think, in American politics than most, because of the strong history or legacy of, goes all the way back to the Revolution, of paranoia in American politics. That's a very major power in American politics. And you can see it today, of course, in Sarah Palin, someone of really no intellectual caliber whatever, basically very stupid, but very, very shrewd, who is a real power in America, in a way that would be, you would have to go back to Williams Jennings Bryan or someone of very limited background having such a power as Sarah Palin. And then of course you've got the Tea Parties as well. So in the United States, I think there's a clear move to emotion over intellect.
I should get the other print guy to comment on that. Do you think it's the decline of the written word and the rise of the image that accounts for part of the reason why emotion is on the rise in public life?
It's a good question. I don't think so. I think that we've had times in our own political lives as Canadians when print was still dominant. I'm thinking during the whole Constitution crisis and the patriation of our Constitution, which was extraordinarily emotional. It paralyzed the country emotionally for the better part of 2 years.
So
yeah.
You're not sold?
I'm not sold. I'm not sold. Neither am I sold on Chris's argument that most decisions by governments are rational. I mean, you came from a very emotional, ideological government. You were part of that. We've got one right now. When, for example, gay rights is removed by the order of the minister from the new citizenship guide, even though we're a country where gay marriage is legal, where we have a pride in the rights that we give to minority groups. I mean, that's an emotional decision. That's not rational.
Well, I guess it's how you determine it. I think basically you're assuming...
Your government's war against teachers. I mean, that wasn't rational.
Well, I guess the point, and I'll make...
the phrase war against teachers is not rational either.
Well, we didn't phrase it that way, frankly.
I know.
It wasn't us phrasing it that way.
But I had to say that.
I think what you're suggesting is, well, because you've taken this position, let's say the gay rights issue, or you've taken the position that we're going to restructure education because we think teachers should work more and so on and so forth, that it's not rational. Well, I think it's very rational. I think it was an extremely intelligent thing to do. Yes, it was the education system wasn't working. Yes, it needed to be changed. Yes, it was about going forward and doing things differently. The other one was welfare. They said, well, you can't cut welfare by 22%. That's a very emotional decision. It was rational. When welfare starts butting up against minimum wage, our argument was nobody's going to take a job for minimum wage, and welfare rolls grow.
Okay, but look at what we're getting into is that I'm saying that's emotional. He's saying it's rational. What do you say?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of equivocation on what we mean by whether or not politicians, for instance, are doing the rational thing. It's certainly possible that politicians can sit and crunch numbers and try to determine the most effective strategy for convincing the public of a certain position or another. And they can be cold and calculating in that way. That's not to say that they arrived at that position. For instance, in the United States, where there's a certain faction of people who are very against gay marriage. Now, there's a question, why are the leaders themselves against gay marriage? They may have arrived at that conclusion through completely irrational means. They might then turn and construct a very, very coldly calculated emotional campaign that can turn the people in their favor. So I question the slippage in which you're saying we're rational, not emotional, is simply saying I'm right to begin with, and I can then rationally implement a strategy that often involves emotion.
So does that apply to those people in favor of gay marriage?
You know, being agnostic as to what the original position is, what you're saying is that we're rational because we can implement this in a rational fashion, right? What's really at the heart of it is not whether or not we're capable of strategy. We could do calculus. Of course we're capable of rationality. The question is the position of the politician arrived at through rational means, and is the method by which they choose to sway the population through rational means? And I don't think that either of those are often the case, yes, while I still grant you that the middle case can be very close.
Christina, then Richard.
Yeah, I actually want to speak briefly on both of the last 2 points. First of all, I don't think that the rise of images or internet-based communication systems has actually increased the role of emotions. Again, I think emotions were always in politics. It's interesting to think about, though, the way in which the internet and things like Facebook might actually be increasing the communication of emotions. So, for example, the anger that was generated after the proroguing of Parliament by Stephen Harper, how quickly both sort of text-based but also a web-based, Facebook-based sort of opposition to that was generated. So I think that it's going to be really interesting to look at what previous emotion theorists talked about, collective emotions, and the way in which they can kind of expand, and a whole populace can actually share emotions. I think what'll be interesting is to see how the web can actually facilitate that, and in some sense facilitate whole social movements organized around emotions like anger, shame, or guilt around certain issues. Secondly, again, I think the more you think about the evidence of how important emotions are in judgment, the less you can really separate rationality and emotions, and you have to think of emotions, I think, at least having rational components. So, for example, we can think about emotions along the lines of intensity. So sometimes anger is wrong just because it's too intense. Sometimes anger is wrong because it's directed at the wrong object, right? So we might be angry at actions by certain individuals in a certain case, but then we target our anger at their whole being, right? So that would be the wrong target of our anger. It doesn't mean that other forms of anger are any less rational. And also the way we react to our emotions. And I think also political debates are quite often about these sorts of things. So of course there was collective fear after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, but the debates that should have been going on is what do we do with this fear? How do we react to it? What should be the reactions to this fear? All of that is emotional-based rhetoric that is also equally rational and needs reason inside it.
Richard.
Well, one thing I want to do is take a shot at your survey, which found that 57, I think it was, but let's say 57% of Canadians said there was too much emotion in Canadian politics, and only 15% said there's too much intellect. Well, I think if you go back to the person asked, I think that was a dumb question. Because if you ask that question, it's like asking a question of someone, are you sexist or are you racist? They're going to say no. You know, and it is seen to be better to be worried about too much emotion rather than too much intellect. Because everybody wants to feel intellectual and all that jazz. We, of course, all of us warp those words to suit our convenience. We often mean by emotion really basically feeling. And if you're intellectual, that's another way of saying you're unfeeling, you're cold, you're all the rest of it. Another way, but if you turn that around to, if I call you emotional, what I'm saying is you're soft, you're gushy, all those things. You know, you don't think, you just
Now, can I follow up on that? Because
yes,
from the Department of, people sometimes say funny thing to pollsters, here was the second question asked. When you go vote, this was the question to Ecos in the Globe and Mail and the Walter Gordon Massey Symposium poll. When you go to vote, is your choice influenced by reason and thinking, emotional consideration, or what? Please, second ballot. And look at this, 86% of the people surveyed said, we are influenced by reason and thinking.
There you are.
And only 9% by emotional consideration. Michael Valpy, what's going on here?
It's not a dumb question. And Richard, whose brilliance and other things I respect.
Not really dumb.
It's not.
Hang on. It's not a dumb question, but are the results worth anything?
Yes, they are, because it shows what public perception is. And I prefer to call it a teachable moment, that we can then bring in Christina and David, who will tell us, well, in fact, you know, this is what this means. This is actually how people think.
It means nothing, Michael.
And it's not. It's what the public perception is. And Frank Graves of Ecos says the same thing, that, you know, he finds those numbers. He's the pollster.
I know he
And
is.
he says he finds those numbers cartoonish.
Cartoonish because?
Cartoonish
So why do you
because
ask the question?
he knows that's not right.
So people are essentially saying what they think the pollster wants to hear in this case.
No, I think there's
no,
that's not what they're saying.
They think they're smart.
Exactly.
They're saying I'm smart,
Exactly.
and I don't make decisions based on that. I make decisions based on logic and reason. And let me tell you a little story. We ran on against Dalton McGuinty the first time.
We being the 95 Tories.
95 Tories.
Mike Harris.
Mike Harris. And we ran, I don't think they were profoundly negative campaigns, but they were negative campaigns by a Canadian standard as opposed to, say, your American standards. But you'd go to the doors and everybody hated negative advertising. They hated it. And I remember knocking on a door and the guy answered the door and he says to me, you know, I like you guys, but I can't stand the negative campaigning you're running. I said, yeah, well, that's the way it goes these days. And then he looked me in the eye and he says, but you know, that McGuinty's just not up for the job.
Which was exactly the
negative campaign. So I think what that poll says to me is the same thing. I think they like to think they're making decisions. I like to think they're saying the right thing when they don't like negative campaigning. But ultimately what works is to go for the emotional, visceral response.
Gotcha. Richard.
Can I just want to say one thing about those negative ads? Because you're right, but you're wrong. Because I think there is in Canada, and in other countries, but it's very definitely in Canada, very strong sense of decency. And people don't like negative ads because they know they're negative. But they are influenced by them, which is another thing. And that is true. We are kind of helpless because it's easier to bash someone than to praise someone. That's that's the basis of the success of negative ads.
David, have you got something on that?
Well, you know, I just want to point out that this question is informative in that if the people do not realize, so if the science is right, and I think that there is a lot of convergence on people who study emotions, that we are so deeply influenced by emotion, and yet so many people think that they themselves are not. What that question is telling us is that if the first step is to be reflective about the root cause of your judgment, then we're far from that, right? So sure, it's not going to tell us whether they really are rational. You can't. That's like asking somebody, "Are you smart?" You know, most people, for instance, one of the most robust findings in psychology is that most people think they're above average on good things, right? You know, you won't be able to shake that. So in that sense, it is cartoonish. It's funny, but it's informative because if you think that people need to realize sort of the pernicious influences of emotion, and they're not all pernicious, I very much agree with Christina, then you know this is cause for pessimism.
But does somebody have to say to the public then, you know what, I know 86% of you all think that reason and thinking is why you're out there casting your ballot, but you're fooling yourselves. Is somebody obliged to say that to them in order?
Yeah, you won't get elected.
That's what we said this morning.
Yeah.
Well, sure, you can say
doing
it,
yourself.
but there's no politician that's going to say it,
Right.
because you don't get elected.
No.
You know, the fact of the matter is, no politician gets elected by saying, "My gosh, you people are dumb," and you know that's not exactly a campaign slogan.
That's the role of the media.
On the whole, I think that is correct.
That is
Chris.
good advice. Let's do one more of these then. Okay, how about, since we're on the subject, emotional manipulation. Political parties exploit and manipulate the emotions of voters. That was the given. Pollster said, do political parties exploit and manipulate the emotions of voters? Only 6% of the people surveyed disagreed with that. 87% of those surveyed agreed with that. So they know they're being manipulated.
They know that everybody else is being manipulated.
Not them, of course.
Clearly, everybody but me.
Exactly
That's
what
right.
you're saying. I'm not being manipulated, but you, Mr. Pagan, are.
I mean, some of these results point to the importance of emotions in life, one of which is self-esteem and shame, the desire to feel good about yourself. So the very fact that you think you're rational, more rational than perhaps you really are, can actually indicate that the need to feel good about oneself, which is very integral to the emotion of shame and honor and pride, which all of us are always mobilized by.
Go to the fix, though.
Points.
What's the fix? The fix is that you've got an electorate out there that really isn't thinking or making decision-making on a rational, fulsome basis.
I disagree with that. I mean, first of all,
well,
I
that's what I'm assuming you're saying. That's
no. So I mean, first of all, it's important to the answer to the first question. Are you rational when you make a decision making? In some sense, it's responding to what people hope or are told that they should be. Right? There is this both from the Enlightenment, as David mentioned, and early modern thinkers saying that politics should be about reason. And in some sense, saying that you're rational is what allows you a place at the table. Reason has always been what privileges certain groups, and just by simply saying that a certain group of people or women, for that matter, are emotional has quite often discredited them from actually being able to have a place at politics. So that's precisely why people want to say, of course I make rational decisions so that they can take part. And I think that the more we use neuroscientific evidence to show that emotions are always at play, even in those instances of politicians who claim that they're rational while other people are hot-tempered, blinded by their emotions, that will actually be, I think in some sense, important and enlightening for these other groups that have been in some sense kept away from the table. I think the more we know about emotions and the integral relationship between reason and emotion, the more politics will benefit from it.
When I tried to argue a short while ago that my judgment, emotion is rising and intellect is falling in public life, I didn't get much traction, didn't get much support. And I think I thought about that a bit, and one reason is we're overestimating the extent to which we have been, over time, rational people. The Enlightenment, that's 18th century, and that's very recent, and that was just in Europe. It's a very small part of the world. Before that, the Greeks, and if you find a few people. But most of the time, most of us have been quite happily emotional, felt no need to apologize for it, took it for granted. That was the way decisions were made. You said something, I got mad at you and hit you over the head with a club. And, and that was the end of the argument. Mm-hmm. But that was how most of us, most of the time, in human history, conducted ourselves. Now we have this urge to be rational, to be seen to be rational, which may be much more superficial and brief than we think.
Michael.
Christina, Frank Graves in his poll, in his interpretation of the poll, argues that what we're seeing in these numbers are what he calls the stranglehold on the political agenda of older men. That we have a demographic that is rapidly aging, this great bulk of people coming up towards the 60s. They profess to be more rational, they're less idealistic, they're more certain of where they are. And then he says in his interview with me this morning in the Globe an interesting thing, that if the 51% of the population who are women were in charge of running things, we'd have a much different political agenda. Mm. Or if people under 45 were setting the agenda, we'd have a much different political agenda. Is that something that fits with your own?
I'm not sure if I would. I mean, I don't know enough about those sorts of facts. I actually think that in some sense what's going on is that men perhaps tend to like to think of themselves. One of the words that came up was courageous. And
exactly.
So that thinking of themselves as courageous, and that
now
seems to be the buzzword.
We're going to get to that. Hold on, I'm going to put a freeze on this because we're actually going to get to that graphic in a second. But I want to read this first from Drew Weston. Chris, I'll get you to comment on it first. Drew teaches and writes down in Atlanta, and he's had this to say. The philosopher David Hume had it right. Reason is the slave to the passions, not the other way around. Recognizing the primacy of passion in everything we do has profound implications for politics. Reason is the middle manager in decision-making, not the CEO. Policies are nothing but the front men for values. You listen to the middleman's pitch, but you go straight to the top when it's time to choose. You go, in other words, to your emotions, particularly your moral emotions, when you pull a lever in the voting booth. Is that your understanding of how it works?
Well, yeah, I think probably. I think, people align themselves with certain political parties, and they align themselves because they're predisposed with agreeing with that particular approach to how government should be run.
But that sounds rational, not emotional.
Well, I agreed. I think it is rational to align yourself with a party that agrees with you on a moral, ethical basis. I don't think that is particularly irrational. I think it is rational. But when you get down to the actual debate, the comment, the give and take, it becomes emotional because you want to be right, you want to win, and you want to be the party that's in power. So I'm having a difficult time separating that portion of the emotional debate with the portion of the rational debate that came first that creates that emotional debate.
But I think the conventional wisdom would be that back in 1995, the progressive conservative campaign people at the time, led by Mike Harris, who eventually won that election, played on emotion big time to win. It wasn't an appeal to the brain, it was an appeal to the heart and the gut more than anything else. Don't you think that's how you want?
Well, I think you gotta accept a certain fact. I think there are only so many things the public can take in from a fact-based point of view. Why do we not have a good healthcare debate in this country? Because it's so complicated and so difficult, and the irrational, the ones that have this emotional output, are the first to say, I believe in one-tier healthcare, I believe in universal access, debate's over. And I think that's a good example of the other side making this emotional response, but not having that irrational debate. Did we do it? Yeah, of course we did. Okay. All politicians do it.
Richard.
I think that's, no, I think that instance of healthcare is wrong. I think it's a very rational reason why people don't want a healthcare debate, because they know the basic debate will be about what do we cut and how do we increase payment. And they want to postpone that. They know that is what any...
But that's not rational, Richard.
It is rational. You're delaying it. If you delay it 10 years, you have gained. And it's the same thing in the States. I mean, the debate, to me, about healthcare in the States is between those who have healthcare and who are scared that if we bring in 50 million people who aren't covered, they who are already inside are going to have their taxes raised.
Well, you see, that is
rational. It may be selfish, but it's rational.
That's an incredible argument, you see. I don't want to deal with this because I don't want to know what the answer is.
Yeah.
Now, most people would say that's called an ostrich putting their head in the sand.
That's got nothing to do with
and now certain people on that side of the debate say, well, you see, that's a rational debate. In my world, you're crazy. You're going to end up with no health care in 10 years because you can't afford it. That seems like a rational debate to me.
Richard, and then Chris, you want one last kick at this? No? Okay, Christina, you wanted to say?
I mean, again, the binaries between these people are rational, these people are emotional, I just don't think that actually, that's not true to the facts. Because, first of all, if you're on one side of the healthcare debate, you can feel compassionate towards all kinds of people who don't have healthcare. That doesn't preclude that you can actually reason in very clear, logical ways about exactly how we can actually go about providing that healthcare in the most rational, in the most sort of cost-effective way. So I think, compassion doesn't in and of itself preclude rationality. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, but we don't. The point I'm making is we don't. We don't have a healthcare debate because it's stopped cold every single time because somebody says, that's two-tier healthcare. And then every politician runs for the hills as soon as they hear, that's two-tier healthcare.
It's definitely happening in the United States over the past year, and it's actually coming to a head this week. So I want to take one question. David, I'll put this to you. Barack Obama, let's talk about him just for a moment here, because massive emotional appeal, of course, to get him elected in the first place, but he's a fairly cool customer, right? He's a fairly reserved guy emotionally. The American public, the polls suggest, like him personally, but overwhelmingly don't like this policy that that he may very well get through this week. You want to explain this dichotomy and this reason versus emotion thing here?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's going on is that as much as people like to say that they prefer reason to emotion, there's good evidence that we like people to possess certain emotions. This makes them human. So the moment you attempt to be too rational, too calculating, what happens is you lose your subjects. And I mentioned this in the op-ed piece today, that one of the great examples of this is when Michael Dukakis in the 1988 election against George Bush was asked whether or not he would be in favor of the death penalty if it had been his wife who had been raped and murdered. Now, it just is true that most of us would react with great anger and desire for revenge if it had been our wives to get raped and murdered, or our child. Dukakis said, no, I would not be, and he gave a cool explanation for why he was opposed to the death penalty. We don't like to see that in our leaders. We want to know that they are the same kinds of people. They have the same priorities and they react the same emotionally. Which is to say, to get back to President Obama right now, he, as intelligent as he is attempting to bring rational discourse to the people. And what I fear that he's communicating is, I am cold and calculating. That is exactly what he did not do in his campaign, which was inspire with hope. And now he's getting, this is a smart guy. He was at the Harvard Law Review. And this guy can lay out all the issues and can bring both sides. Well, and we just, the public just doesn't like to see that.
Could he bring that rational debate to the people if he hadn't already connected emotionally with them?
Probably not, but he needs to keep them going. So we're fickle. We have short memories. all of the inspiration that he gave us during the campaign needs to be maintained. And
But
so,
we're looking for that perfect combination of reason and emotion.
right.
Richard.
Well, I think Obama was trapped by something else. He was seen to be weak. You know, in other words, being intellectual, saying on the one hand this, on the other hand that, bipartisanship, all these worthy things but boring, were hurting him. And so now he is going around kicking. He's now kicking, you know what? It bothers Ignatieff on this side. But it's interesting to watch Obama looking for fights. And he's picking fights with people. He's picking one with Netanyahu to Israel at the moment. He's making the most of that. He's going to show that he's tougher than Netanyahu. And he needs to do that. And he's kicking the insurance companies.
Let's throw some more numbers out here. Emotion versus rationality. People prefer politicians who connect with, what do you suppose? Let's put this up, Michael. People prefer by 80, look at that, 88%. People prefer the connection by reason and intelligence versus level of emotions, just 6%.
Collective delusion.
Collective delusion?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, that's simply not true. I mean, that's what the whole discussion has been about for the last, whatever it is, 45 minutes.
Well, tell me this. When you ran for office once, maybe a couple times actually. You went door to door.
Yeah.
When you went knocking on doors, people interested in what you have to say? Were you appealing to their rational side?
At a certain point.
Yeah?
At a certain point in the campaign, and then they wanted to engage in a dialogue with about their country. And they wanted to engage with the guy who was standing talking to them on their doorstep. It was quite a fascinating experience.
Chris, how about you in Etobicoke? Knocking on doors?
Well, yeah, you knock on doors. I mean, it was the order of the day. What was the issue of the day, et cetera? Did I find that they were overly informed? Generally not. Did I find they understood most of the issues? Generally not. Did I think they're stupid? No, I don't think they're stupid. I think they're bright people. They didn't have enough time to actually figure it out. And did I think that the parties that were effective actually wedge issues, create the emotional side to get elected? Absolutely they did. I'm not so, but I keep coming back to the point. I'm not so sure that because they understood how to get the emotional vote out of the people means they didn't think of it in a strategic, thoughtful, understandable way and create good policy. There's nothing wrong with making an emotional decision and also have good policy.
Right. That's kind of like saying, well, we're the smart ones, so let's use least common denominator strategies for the masses of emotional idiots.
Well, I wouldn't say, but that's not fair. All you're saying is that you're trying to get elected, and you're trying to do your best.
I completely agree with you, but you
can't educate everybody. That was the difficulty you're faced with as a political party. Yeah, Kim Campbell was right in that election.
Election campaigns are no time to have a serious discussion about issues.
She's absolutely right. And I mean, it's the dumbest thing to say.
Should you say it out loud?
Yeah, no, she should never have said it. But it's true. In 6 weeks, you can't bring the public up to speed on healthcare, defense, Iraq, Afghanistan, and have everyone walk in there and make a logical, rational vote. Therefore, what do you go after? You go after the emotional side.
What we're saying
Which is not negative. I mean, they're going to connect with you as a human being.
I don't think it's negative at all.
What we're saying is that the basic decision is always an emotional one, and I think it is. And I fascinated to watch Obama becoming emotional, because emotional has power. Emotional means you care, and it means you're authentic.
But here's the follow-up. Here's the follow-up. If it really is emotion, that is the kind of 9 out of 10 by which you make your decision, and maybe there's 1 out of 10 for rationality, does that mean your odds of getting it right are not that good?
No, because I mean, most of us we all make the most important decision in our life on intuition, which is who we fall in love with. You know, I mean, we all, you know, don't underestimate emotion, don't underestimate the irrational side of human nature.
Well, he just said you improve the odds of getting it wrong when you vote by emotion.
Chris is defending the conservatives as being rational. A lot of the time you are doing that.
So.
Well, you keep on using the word rational.
Hang on, tell me what you mean when you say if 90% of your decision-making process is based on emotion, chances are you're going to get it wrong. That's what you're saying.
Yes, I think you've got to have some serious, rational, thoughtful input into making a policy decision. And if you're making most of your decisions based in today's world on emotion, listen, they go to focus groups, they poll, they figure out what words they're going to use, they right down to the fine point. So
Christina.
It's not emotional.
Is the fact that when you're thinking about what is the rational strategy, should we go to war with Iraq or should we have healthcare reform, all of those things are going to bring in emotions, right? Emotions of compassion. What should we be angry about people who abuse that? And so, I mean, again, these are interrelated. And getting back to the poll we just saw, I think Barack Obama is a great example of as Michael said, how delusional that is, that people want politicians to be rational. I think we saw a lot of support for Barack Obama during his campaign because he was using both positive emotions like hope and compassion and negative emotions like anger, all of which are mobilizing. People were angry about the financial situation. and as well they should be, they were also hopeful about the future.
But
and I think in some sense, so it also actually shows that in some sense his support is now waning because he's gone back to the more professorial Obama weighing facts, and then he uses the anger.
What do you say?
No. The problem with
and
campaigning strictly on emotional and not putting in the policies and initiatives in place that you back them up with, and this is what Obama did. He campaigned on hope and change, and there was nothing left. It was an empty bag after hope and change. Book it.
No,
any political person, let me finish. Any political person could have told you he is set up for disaster. Because it's a house of cards. Bob Rae, NDP, 1990, he campaigned on hope and change, and then he had to go in and make decisions, and the house of cards came down.
No, he also there was a huge deficit.
Okay, one second, guys. We can't all talk about it. Can I put this up here now?
Yeah.
The emotions people want to see in their politicians. We talked about this a little bit earlier. The best which emotions would you most like to see in a politician? What do you think came up first? Courage came up first. 34% said courage, 23% empathy, 21% caring, compassion, 18%, there's your Obama vote, hope and optimism. How about the next? Let's flip it over. What emotions would you least like to see in a politician? Let's put that one up. Jealousy, resentment, okay, that's not very appealing. Insecurity, again, fear, anger, and all the way down. Okay, Richard, react to that.
I can give you an example of the combination of emotion and courage. The greatest in the 20th century, Churchill, after France's fall and the war is lost, quite obviously. And what does he say to the British people? I have nothing to offer you but blood, sweat, and tears. He understood his audience. He didn't say, we can fight on, we're not defeated, we can, we're by no means over, all that kind of stuff. He told them the bitter truth, and it worked. And so the right thing at the right time, and it's pure emotion.
Michael.
But isn't that interesting that was done in a wartime context, and this is in a peacetime context?
What, today?
And, yeah.
No, we're at war, sir.
With whom?
Well, we are at war in Afghanistan right now.
Yeah, but that's not a total all-out war that Richard was suggesting.
Granted.
I think that courage factor reflects this older male stranglehold on the political agenda, which I was asking Christina about, and now over to you.
Yes. Well, two things. First of all, I actually argue that courage is not an emotion. It's a virtue.
Same exact thing.
I mean, one of the things that I love about
people identified it.
Yes, and people I think of happiness and moderation and generosity as emotions.
Why do we want to see this in our politicians more than anything else?
As the ancients showed, no emotions are virtues or vices. So courage is feeling fear in the right way, to the right degree, reacting to it in the right way. If we feel fear too much or too little, then that's rashness or cowardliness. So what we want in politics are virtues and vices, which are good and bad forms of all of the emotions, because as humans, we're stuck with all of them. We will have compassion, we will have anger, we will have fear, and what we want are the most important, the best forms of those.
But if the binary is reason and emotion, I mean, surely courage falls
it's not.
on
Again,
the
I
emotion
reject
side.
the binary of reason and emotion. There's as much reason in compassion as there is in fear
But
as
this
there is
much
in
my hunch is this much we can say. If courage came out at number one, that's a reflection of a post-9/11 world in which we live.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And you were in office at that time.
Yeah.
And did you find that at that time somehow the people's need to feel secure,
yes.
people's need to see courage
Yes.
at the center was
absolutely.
important?
Absolutely.
How did that manifest itself?
Well, I think it manifested itself just in the calls you got, just in the emails, just in the newspaper, just in the interviews you did, just in the cabinet meetings you went to. And we were this far away, obviously, in Ontario, but the cabinet meetings we went to right after where we were preparing for, okay, what's now? Where are we going from here? We were this close, et cetera, et cetera. I saw that very clearly in it. And frankly, it struck me at how quickly the public wanted you to do something. They didn't care almost what it was. They wanted you to do something. To demonstrate to them, you're in control, you've got this under control, and how are we going to protect ourselves in the future? I can't even imagine being the President of the United States or the Governor of New York, how much pressure was on them. And I think they both showed a considerable amount of courage, and that's where their poll numbers went way up.
Don't forget the mayor of New York City.
And the mayor of New York, and that's where their poll numbers went way up.
I think courage is, in part, is synonym for decisiveness. They see the two related. And our best example, we don't obviously have many occasions when we're looking for a leader who can be a war leader. But I think our closest example was Pierre Trudeau. And people really responded to him when he took immense risks facing down the premiers to get the patriation, the Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Everybody knew it was make or break.
Or against the separatists too.
Well, against separatists, but this one was one that caught up the emotions of English Canadians in a way. You know.
Well, let me go to David on this. Which do you think are the most relevant emotions in politics?
Well, you know, depends what you mean by relevant. If by relevant you mean which ones are the ones that are most effectively used and therefore take the forefront, I can speak at least in American politics. Very effective emotions are fear and anger, and to some extent the politics of disgust, which we've seen growing. And maybe I want to chime in a little bit to clarify this dichotomy between reason and emotion is something that's hard to tackle. But in the cases of fear, for instance, and anger, disgust, these are emotions that, if it were true that emotions were completely irrational, we wouldn't have them. That is, in the sense that emotions serve a very, very important purpose. They allowed our ancestors to survive. That is, one of the primary features of emotions is to bypass deliberation so that you can act in a way that will keep you alive for the next day. So if we had to sit and think about whether is that really a snake? Is this a poisonous snake? No, we wouldn't live to see another day. Now, it's rational in that local sense. So fear protects us. It protects us in small communities. We protect our family. One of the things that fear does to judgment is it elevates our sense of risk in the environment. So when I'm afraid, all of a sudden I see risk where there wasn't before. So a twig all of a sudden looks like a snake to me. That's an error that we're fine making because the opposite error is the worst one. Now, it's rational in that sense, and in fact it's extraordinarily rational because of the advantage it provides. But when we're all of a sudden faced in a society where our decisions are not local decisions, they're not about snakes and twigs, they're not about whether my neighbor is going to beat me over the head with a bat. They are, what's the best thing to do for the 2 million people that are out of jobs? All of a sudden those emotions become they're not very well calibrated. So one of the best emotions that you can use are those powerful emotions like fear and anger that are deeply rooted in us.
Let me go to the other side of this, though. You mentioned fear and anger, and just what popped into my head right now. Chris, let me go to you on this. Most people at this table, certainly ones from Canada, remember a woman named Marilyn Shirley, who was a cabinet minister in that Bob Rae government in 1990. I think she's a citizenship court judge right now. They were having a debate at the cabinet table in 1990 about whether to cut welfare rates because the deficit was sky high and they needed to bring the books back into balance or try anyway. And somebody suggested, well, we got to put a lid on these welfare rates. And not fear and anger, but she had what others have described to me as a kind of emotional meltdown at that table. And she had been on welfare, and she said, had it not been for welfare, my family wouldn't have made it. That wasn't an appeal to fear and anger. That was an appeal to, I mean, absolutely right here to the heart. How much of that happens in public life to move policy along? And she, incidentally, and she saved the rates. They did not go down.
Right.
You guys did that when you got in.
I think a lot more than you think, frankly, because I think a lot of people come to the job with a history, and fear and emotion and all those things bring their life they've traveled. And it's quite often you'll find people making decisions based on what happened to them in their life that you kind of look at and go, well, really, that's not really a conservative position, or that doesn't really fit with our mold. But you can see that through someplace else in their life, they've experienced something that has changed their mind. I think that's probably a good thing, frankly, that you've actually developed in this way. It's an emotion, and it's clearly an emotion that they bring up to the table from a long time ago, as Shirley would be a great example, because it was a long time ago that she was on welfare, yet there she was at the cabinet table, evoking that emotion about welfare rates. I think it's a lot more common than you think.
Christina, is it the left or the right that is more successful in appealing to the emotions?
Unfortunately, I think it's the right. I would say that although President Obama's campaign might actually be an important recent incident where it wasn't the case that the right had a monopoly on the emotions. And one of the problematic things, I think, is that people tend to look at the right and say, yes, they've figured out politics, they've figured out that what people call negative emotions like anger and fear work in politics, and that's what you should actually do to mobilize the population. I think that sometimes I think both the left and the right use those emotions. One thing, though, I want to point out is that, and this gets back to some of what David was saying about our physiology. We have emotions because they worked to help us survive. Fear was an emotion that helped us survive in in situations where there was imminent danger. When situations are far more complex, we now have not just the amygdala, but the neurocortex, and so our more complex emotions of fear do involve rationality. So what it is we're afraid of does involve much more complicated reasoning sort of procedures that I think means that we can always, politicians can always sort of take the cheap way out and appeal to those base emotions, but I think that it's much more, it's much nobler for them to sort of bring in, and I think they have. I think it works. I think that's why
Obama is quite right to say that the right does better on emotional. No, it does. No, it just does. The fact of life. But why? I think it's because the left is proposing what are seen to be good things. Like more social housing, better welfare, and so on. And the right is seen to be stopping bad things. And it's the negative approach that is more powerful. It's why negative advertising always works. It's the right is basically saying, we're going to stop a whole bunch of bureaucrats coming into your house and telling you what to do. We're going to stop you being slaughtered by high taxes. It's negative, and that works.
Chris.
Well, I don't think you're right, frankly. I'll tell you why the right. Because the right has the ability to invoke those wedge issues. In this country, at least, the Liberals can't. If you ever went to a Liberal...
They did in the last Ontario election.
They tried. No, that one was a mistake from the Conservative point of view. They weren't running as Conservatives. That was the mistake. The point I want to make is, the Liberals, if you go to a Liberal caucus meeting, you can have somebody out here on the left and another person out here on the right. There is no commonality. It's a big tent, I admit, but it doesn't create commonality. When you go to a caucus meeting of the Conservatives, it starts about here and goes to about here. They can put a wedge issue out there because everybody agrees with that wedge issue. The Liberals will put a wedge issue out, whether it's on the right side or the left side, and half the caucus is dumping on the wedge issue, while the other half thinks it's wonderful. If they go the other way, they change places. That's why the right's better, because they can come down, go into caucus, they're predisposed to agreeing because they like-minded individuals. That's why they got elected. They represent a narrow band on the right of center side, and they can put those wedge issues out there, argue in unison for them, and win votes publicly.
David?
This reminds me of earlier on to say that the strategy that you seem to be endorsing, that of the side that manipulates the emotions best wins, is such a deeply pessimistic stance on it. Because
I am pessimistic.
Yeah, but what happens is that the side that wins is not the ones with the right issues, which I assume that you would want, right? You're convinced that you're right about the issues. Fair enough.
That's right, yeah.
But now what if the other side actually develops better techniques emotionally, and they start implementing them? Would you still endorse it, or would you start saying, let's get emotion out of politics?
Well, but probably I'd say let's get emotion out of politics. That's probably what I'd say, because the game plan for me is, and I hate to be such a down-to-earth pragmatic. The game plan is, I believe in my political views. I believe in my public policies.
Right.
Now I want to get elected to implement them.
So it's by any means necessary.
That's my point.
Right. So the public should be very, very wary of people like that.
But I don't believe anyone's any different than me. I just think they have a high and mighty way. Obama's no different than me. He just carries himself differently and sells the package differently. I'm not elected, so I can come on here and say this. If I were elected, that's not exactly the approach I'd be taking.
I can read a teleprompter better than any of us.
Yes, he can. That's for darn sure.
And also,
Christina?
one lesson that the Liberals might take with this notion of negative campaigning, again, it fits in with my view that all emotions are always important in public decision making. And you notice that the more successful sort of left campaigns, things like Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, he was angry. I mean, he was compassionate about human rights, that all people deserve these things. So anger and compassion can be used to mobilize people. I think the Liberals need to learn. And similarly with Obama, we might think about hope as what really got him in, but there was so much anger against the previous administration.
Anger works.
Anger works
sometimes.
Anger work, but anger can be rational.
I remember being in the legislature and someone saying to me something, that is not, it was just below the belt. And I blew up. And frankly, when I left the legislature, do you want to apologize? No. If he said it again, I'd blow up again. I don't think the public gets, you lose support.
I mean, social movements couldn't have any effect on politics because they don't have access to resources. They have to use things like anger and shame in order to actually get a point on the table. So I think, again, no emotion is bad. I mean, what it is that we're angry about might be problematic. How we deal with our anger or the policies we implement, but anger itself is a very important emotion.
David and Mike.
And you notice from the poll, actually, that Canadians are saying, well, anger's not that bad an emotion to be there. But what bothers me is that hope and optimism doesn't really register very highly. That that
Yeah, and I
people
think-
aren't saying, well, you know, that hope and optimism is something we should see in our politics.
I wonder
think
if it would have been different a year ago before
Exactly, exactly. I
Obama had
think it
taken
has
over.
been
We seem to be in fairly good shape.
Or I wonder
so
if they
there's not a
presume
pressure.
it.
They
You know,
presume it anyway.
yeah, I presume that they want hope and
How am I
optimism.
doing on time here?
Yeah.
2 minutes? 2.5 minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to point out, in the interest of fairness, that you're absolutely right. There are such things as justified emotions. Anger and injustice, I think, is a rational stance. The problem is it's so easily elicited. Anger and fear are so easily elicited that they can lead you to overextend that emotion. And this is one thing that psychologists have shown over and over again, is that anger or fear or any emotion discussed as something that's completely unrelated can influence judgment in a new domain. And that's the danger. And in the interest of balance, liberals do this very well also with compassion. That is, there is a danger that inducing compassion in the people for a singular case can lead to a very bad public policy decision. But you can pull our heartstrings in the same way that you can make us feel fear and feel anger. And so the error can be made by both sides. The question is, at what point are you willing to use these to manipulate people into having that emotion influence new, unrelated areas?
Well, you're right with the
I've got to
liberals
say
there.
that the one thing I think liberals are better at in campaigning is humor, but it's a very risky thing. You do it wrong, you're in deep trouble.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think the goal at the end of the day should be to get emotion out of politics altogether?
No. It's totally legitimate, and you can't do it. It's there, but you have to obviously find, this is obvious, find the right balance.
But David, you've argued in the op-ed in the Globe this morning that it's possible to get to a more rational politics.
I think so, but I may be more of an optimist than the other
Chris.
folks.
What do you mean by that?
So what I mean is that emotions
emotion is
energize.
more rationality.
Emotions energize, and they can energize reasons. The problem is that you need an independent standard now to say, is this emotion appropriate for this situation? Is fear at 9/11 enough to justify losing some of the rights that we've had for instance, in the legislation that came that limited a lot of Americans' freedom? And so you need sort of an independent standard. Now, the problem with removing emotions is that you will get apathetic people. We are not automatons. We're not capable of being completely emotionless. But what you need is some way, and I hate to say this, but Jon Stewart, who's you may be familiar with in The Daily Show, does this masterfully. That is, he uses emotions, but he points out inconsistencies. This is a rational strategy. Now, he may take it too far, but we have the tools to be able to determine whether or not a certain political party is being completely inconsistent. Using that rule, are you really being fair in feeling anger in this case and not in this case?
Forgive me, but the only tool that's important right now is the clock. And we're out of time. And Mr. Speaker,
enough.
I didn't have to throw anybody
You
out
were
today. It was
good.
great.
Nobody
All
was
right.
named, nothing.
Can I thank David Pizarro from Cornell University, Christina Tarnopolsky from McGill University, thanks for making the trip to Toronto, Richard Gwyn, Michael Valpy on the bookends, Chris Stockwell in the middle. Thanks so much, everybody, for your participation tonight.